Hello and welcome to the second part of this four-part tutorial on the entire production pipeline for the shot we recreated out of Star Wars Rogue One. In the first tutorial we went through scene setup in terms of textures and also the pipeline between Mari for texturing and Maya. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at basic scene setup in Maya 2017 using the Arnold renderer. So, as you can see, I've brought in the assets that Federico textured and modeled. And if you look in our outliner, you can see so that we have here. So we have the bridge, then we have our TIE Fighter Hero. And I've named it Hero because it's the kind of the closest one to our actor. And then in the background, we also have other TIE Fighters, X-Wings, just to create kind of some atmosphere and some stuff going on in the background. But I'm going to hide those for now. Then we have our lights. So we have these landing lights here, an area light, mesh light, which didn't end up using. We also have an IBL, really basic setup, our sun, and then a fill light. These paths here are just motion paths I've used to animate the background elements. So we're going to be using Arnold for this. One of the main differences between Maya 2017 and 2016 is in terms of rendering, is the render layer setup. Maya 2017 doesn't use render layers like you used to see down here in your channel box. It now uses this render setup window. And first glance, things might look a bit more complicated, and they probably are actually. It works in much the same way as you add things to layers and you create overrides for those layers. So that when you come to render out, you can have more control over the different passes that you export, and it gives more control to your 2D guys who are going to be doing comp. So I'm going to show you how we would set up the TIE Fighter render layer. So I'm just going to delete that. One of the things we want is if I play through in the timeline, you can see our TIE Fighter, which has been animated, pops up from behind the bridge. So when we render this out, we want the TIE Fighter to be occluded by this bridge. And so we want to use what's called a holdout on this bridge. So if we open up our render settings, just going to make that a bit smaller. The first thing I want to do is create a new layer. So click that button there and it's going to open up render setup layer 1. And I'm going to call this TIE Fighter. Now what we need to do is create something called a collection. And these collections give you control over in each layer what the overrides you're applying. So we're going to create a collection, and I'm going to call this TIE Fighter Renderable. Now, this is just the naming conventions I use, but obviously it's completely up to you what you want to use, but it just makes it kind of easier to read. I've spelled that wrong. So, what do we want to be renderable in this layer? Obviously, it's our TIE Fighter layer, so we are going to add our TIE Fighter Hero group. And I'm just going to middle click and drag over into here. And so now, when I render this, essentially this layer only has this object visible. So now what I want to do is I want to create a holdout for the bridge. So I'm going to create another collection, and I'm going to call this TIE Fighter Holdout. And now you need to think about what objects you want to occlude the TIE fighter. So for us, it's the bridge geometry. So now I have these two collections set up. This will render normally, and this TIE fighter holdout at the moment will also render normally because we haven't told Maya that on this collection we want the shader to apply a holdout. So if we click on one of our objects in the bridge, and we'll jump over to our attribute editor, and now we'll go to the bridge shader that's been applied, and this is just a regular Arnold standard shader. I'll just do a quick render so that you can see. If we hop into our render view, so I need to firstly tell Maya that this is the layer that I want to render, because by default it will just render your scene layer, which is essentially your kind of beauty layer, what used to be called, I think, main in Maya 2016. At the moment, this is what our render looks like. We've got the bridge object in the scene, and we've also got the TIE fighter in the scene. But obviously, we want this object to cast reflections and also spill color onto our TIE fighter, but we don't want it to be visible in our alpha channel. So at the moment, if we look at our alpha, you can see that our bridge is being taken into account as well, and we don't want that. So I'm going to close out the Arnold render view, and I'm going to go back to our render settings. In our TIE fighter layer, I'm going to click on the TIE fighter holdout. And there's a section down here which says add override. The override we want to add is in the shader, the Arnold standard shader. So we go across and in here, and at the top of the standard shader there's this option called matte. If we open up this drop down, what I want to do is I want to drag this attribute, the enable matte checkbox, onto our override here, like that. And now it's created a shader override for us. And if we click on our shader override, and in this layer I want AI enable matte. And now for all the standard shaders in this layer, it's going to apply that matte. So now if we hop into our render view again, now you can see that we've created a holdout for our bridge. And also in our alpha, you can see that we have just the TIE fighter visible, which is good. And it's going to make it a lot easier to comp later. I'm also going to show you quickly how to generate an ambient occlusion layer. So I'm just going to delete that out. I'm going to do exactly the same as I did before, create a new layer, call this amb-oc. I'll show you how to do ambient occlusion, but obviously this same principle can be applied to any shader override. So this is going to be called amb-oc. Renderable again. And because we want both our bridge and TIE fighter in there, I'm just going to select them both, drag them in. Okay, and so we're going to create a shader override on this ambient occlusion layer. So now we have this shader override. I'm going to come up here where it says override shader. I'm going to click the checkbox, and I'm going to click on the Arnold tab, and I'm going to click AI ambient occlusion. So now, if I make sure that this ambient occlusion layer is selected, I'll go back to our render view, and I'll render it. And now you can see that we have an ambient occlusion shader applied to everything in our scene. So although this render setup system might be slightly different to how you're used to doing it with render layers, it can be quite useful and easier to see the overrides that you had on a layer, whereas in 2016 you just had the layers and you kind of had to remember what you had overridden, whereas now you can see it in a kind of hierarchical fashion. So this same principle can be applied to any kind of shader override. You could do like a facing ratio and get a Fresnel pass out, or you can do like an ID pass where you can color different objects. There's, I think, a tutorial on the Solid Angle website for doing ID passes in Arnold, so I'm not going to go through that, but this would be the way that you could do it. So I'm just going to talk through the lighting setup now. So as I said before, we have these landing lights. If I make sure, yeah, I'm on my viewport with lights enabled, and I'll play through, you can see that I've got these to flash, and it looks a lot more extreme in the viewport than it does in the render. So it looks a lot brighter, but all I've done with these is I created point lights, and then if we look at the graph editor, I just did a really basic animation, and then I set that to cycle. So you get this flashing effect, which looks kind of cool. It just gives a bit more atmosphere to the scene. So that's the landing lights. These two lights I was messing around with to try and match the footage that we shot. I'm not going to go through those now, but these were just physical lights we had when we were shooting the footage. And so now this ENV Skydome light is our IBL. And we shot the footage indoors, but we're trying to recreate an exterior scene. So I plugged in just a regular HDR map into the IBL. And if we look at the light shape, actually I'll talk about this. The sun direction is just a regular directional light. It has obviously no decay and is essentially light emit from a plane like the sun would be. And then this fill light I added behind the camera just to add, and I've given it a slight blue tinge just to add a bit more colour into the scene. It's a pretty low intensity, low exposure, so it's not really doing that much. It's just to fill in a few gaps that were left on the front of the TIE Fighter. So I'll just go through quickly the light settings. Obviously you have your intensity, and this is kind of multiplied by your exposure here. The resolution is the resolution of the texture that you're using. So this wants to be the width of the texture that you're using. These three are standard with any light. Illuminates by default, whether it's on or off. Emits diffuse, emits specular, so you can have more control. The format is basically what format the IBL is in. This is a lat long, but you can also have like an angular, or if you just had a mirrored ball, but this is lat long. The samples of the light are going to control the amount of noise in your scene. So that kind of brings me on to the render settings. So Arnold is a great renderer, and one of the issues that you can have is the amount of noise in your scene. And if you come over to the sampling tab, you can see these options here. And unlike Mental Ray, Arnold will continue firing rays into the scene, around the scene, until you give it an appropriate amount of noise. What's acceptable amount of noise in your scene, and that's where you set up your sampling. So these samples are basically how many diffuse samples per pixel, how many glossy per pixel, refraction, etc. You also have this checkbox here, lock sampling pattern, is important if you have any kind of animation, and it's going to prevent that flickering effect that you get with final gathering mental ray. If you lock the sampling pattern, then it's going to send the same rays to the same positions in your scene, and so it's going to remove the flicker that you get. So ray depth, this is essentially how many times each ray that's cast from the camera can then essentially bounce around the scene. So the higher these values, the greater your render time is going to be. But also it's gives you kind of more artistic control over how much noise you have in your scene. So you want to really play around with these values until you find a kind of suitable level of noise. But Arnold's great for doing that because you can essentially debug where the noise is coming from in your scene. So if I'm going to put this really low again, so 1, we have these AOVs, which are essentially render passes, arbitrary output variables, they're called. And they're super easy to set up, and they come standard just with the Arnold shaders that you're given. So with the AI standard, which is pretty much the only shader that's applied in this scene, you're given these options. You can have a direct diffuse, direct specular, indirect diffuse, indirect specular, refraction, and these as well. Obviously, I'm not using any subsurface scattering or emission, so I'm not using those AOVs. We also have these built-in AOVs, so we can do an ID pass, a normal pass, a point world pass, Z depth, motion blur, and these things in Mental Ray would have been much more difficult to set up, but in Arnold you literally click a button and it's done. So I'm going to show you how we could kind of debug, if I make sure I'm on the right render layer. So if you do a render, if you come into the render view, you can then access all these different AOVs up the top. So say I went to my direct diffuse, I could see how much noise is coming into my diffuse layer or in my specular layer. So this is a way, if you have a lot of noise in like your direct specular layer, you can increase your specular samples. Or if you have noise in your indirect specular, like we do, you would probably want to increase your light samples. So indirect layers, if you have noise, increase your light samples, generally speaking. And in your direct, it will probably be your render samples. And it tells you up here how many samples per pixel maximum you can get, because you also have a total of 10 down here ray depth wise. So you can, this is excluding the lights, yeah, it says see total, no lights. So it's really easy to debug the noise in your scene, and it gives you more control over where your samples are coming from and where the quality in your images are coming from. So obviously if there's like no refraction happening in your scene, then you can put your refraction samples much lower. And if there's no subsurface materials in your scene, then you don't need any, it's wasted sampling if you use these. So it's easy in theory to control where the noise is coming from. and it gives you much more control. So I know this has been a brief tutorial, but I hope you've learned a bit about how the new render settings work, and you can move on from here and use Arnold in your own project. The next tutorial, we're going to be looking at the 2D side of the pipeline, so integrating our green screen footage and then also comping all our renders together. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and look forward to seeing you soon.